This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 11. The Eastern Woodland. It was night. The summer had passed, and it was almost the eve of Decimus's wedding to Alistair's daughter, Callisto. In the far reaches of the woodland, a secret meeting was taking place. A shadow lay upon a clearing in the forest, a council of a number of creatures of powerful importance. Gron sat upon his dark reptilian steed, his iron crown upon his huge bald head, and his green-skinned hands clad in iron gauntlets. 5 brown-skinned ogres, each with horns and massive fangs dangling from their mouths, stood guard at his flanks, one with a crude and blade-like bow, 2 with 2-handed axes, and another with a bone and flayed skin, battle standard embossed with the red and black fist of the orcs. These ogres were each a captain of the dread fortress that guarded the passage into the orc lands to the far east. Gron ignored their presence, and they ignored the fact they were ignored. They were waiting for the arrival of the next council member. There was a terrifying clap of thunder without lightning from the south, and Gron turned, unconcerned to see the newcomer. A tall and terrifying figure rode forth. He was dressed in black, like Gron, but he was clad in heavy armor, head to toe. His armor bore the marks of the ancient kingdom, and his sword, which was being carried by his horse, was a long, 2-handed blade of brilliant craftsmanship. The men who rode with him were clad in similar armor, but they had less physique to them in comparison to their master. Their helmets were pointed upwards in a long spine, and their armor bore spikes all around it. This was Barjag the Fish, the immortal of the pirates, with his company of his chosen of Gladium. The 2 immortals met each other in the clearing but made no greeting, instead simply staring at each other with ageless eyes. They continued to wait, the steeds fidgeting restlessly on the spot. The ogres at the flanks of the pair were making provocative expressions and gestures at the men to pass the time. But then, finally, the 3rd member of the meeting arrived. This one was different from the others. He wasn't dressed all in black, but red and grey. His armor was made of gold-imbued steel of the ancient dragon, and he wore a crown of golden thorns around his hood, framing his face, which was hidden in shadow. He was Dorogon, one of the brothers of the Kenshi. Accompanying him were 3 men completely covered in black metal armor with masks that matched their samurai attire. They bore the standard of the shogun of the Kenshi on their backs, with white steel katanas on their belts. The meeting was almost complete. They were waiting for the 4th leading immortal of the meeting. As they waited, immortals of the lesser-known races, both old and new, arrived in silence. Some walked proudly clad in the garb of the races they represented, but many of the others were hunched and with their faces averted or covered in filthy garbs. Many of them simply took their places in the shadows and made no attempt to speak. Others signaled each other in some form or embraced as friends, but the silence remained unbroken. Before long, the last man arrived, Vilmen. He was dressed in the skin of a bear and mounted on his black steed, a huge dire wolf with scarlet red eyes. He had no escort, and he slowly approached the others, his giant 2-handed halberd on his back, shining dark and cruel in the moonlight. Everyone of importance was in attendance now. As if life suddenly surged in him, Gron spoke, drool falling from his mouth. "Brothers," he greeted. "Brother," the other immortals whispered as one, their voices causing ripples in the wind and leaves. "All right," Gilorn whispered. "Everyone's here." "Shut it," Iorlem hissed. "We didn't come all this way to get caught stating the obvious." He pushed a small bush aside gently to get a better view from their hiding place in the tree line. "Things are going according to plan," Gron growled. "How?" Dorrigan whispered. His voice was over 100 different voices, all of them speaking at the same time. "The Golden King is dead. The South is in turmoil. Its power is broken. We have lost a major ally." "The Golden King was no ally to us," Barjag spat, his spit smelling of salt water. "He did not follow the will of us immortals, and he perished following his own wants. His son has taken the mantle, but his power is weak. We can bring someone of our own to fill his place." "Who?" Dorrigan turned, weightlessly, to look at his brother. "Who is left in that ruin of a kingdom?" "He is right," Vilmin grunted. "The South is broken. They cannot fight with the same purpose as they once did. We must give them a legend to aspire to then." Gron let out a snarl. "The South may be weak, but they can command the fiercest force in all the world when united. We must make it so." He turned to Barjag. "How long would it take?" "I am of Gladium," Barjag sneered. "Not of the South. This is not in my power." "Assign another," Dorrigan whispered. Gron nodded. "Ramal," he called to the shadows surrounding them. There was a hiss of discontent around the group. "Ramal cannot be trusted," Dorrigan whispered eerily. "He is named so thus. He is a snake." "I am the greatest of my brothers," Gron shouted, slamming his massive hammer into the ground and burying it enough so that it stood in the earth by itself. "Ramal is of the ancient South. His knowledge will be what makes this effort work. Let it be done, and that will end it." They nodded and stepped their steeds back. The immortal man named Ramal stepped forward. As if he had stepped into a spotlight, he became illuminated. His decrepit, albeit clean outfit was washed away into smoke to reveal his new attire. He was dressed in the golden armor of a pharaoh and wore the helm of a great snake. "I will betray you," he said to Gron. He didn't seem to have the concept of preamble. Gron nodded as if in respect to this point. "Take your place, brother. Stand with us once more." Ramal bowed. He threw his arms out, and he suddenly shone with new vigor. The fangs of the snake became more pronounced and shining metallic wings unfurled on his back. He took his place in the circle. Gron seemed to have grown taller with his dominance. Though they were disgruntled, the other immortals fell into line. "What of our brother in Rome?" "I have planted the seeds of his downfall," Vilmin said. "The magic of greed has been claimed by our enemies. Their forces to the north are nothing compared to the south. They follow instinct as only mortals do. Soon we will be able to move our enemies as if they were our own forces." "The leaders are the biggest threat to our cause," Gron growled. "We must turn them against themselves before we can act." "Your concern is nothing," Barjag said coolly. "Their desire for war has already begun. Conspirators has been exiled. Their greatest commander sits in an empty castle. We can take the kingdom with an army of urchins. You will wait until all the pieces are in place." "Will I?" Barjag sneered again. Gron let out a growl and the fish resettled himself. "Allow a show of force then. I shall engage them to truly see how weak they are." "You run the risk of unifying them," Dorrigan hissed. "All the better, I say," Vilmin growled. "King's men are harder to kill when spread out." Gron nodded. "What of Dragon's Keep?" "My people long for war," Dorrigan echoed, savouring the word. "It is who they are. The man on the throne may wish for peace with the kingdom, But I need merely command war, and it will happen. For I am Shogun. I await your word. Good, Gron snarled. What of your dark magic? My magic is my concern. Pray it remains so, brother. My power has grown so much since we faced each other all those centuries ago. Good. Gron gazed silently at Dorrigan. My orcs are on the rise. My armies are marshalling. All resistance in my realm has been eliminated, and my slave force is greater than ever. The kingdom is on the verge of tearing itself apart. We will strike soon. Will you be leading us? Barjag asked. I am not one for repeating the same mistakes, Gron grunted, with some disdain. I will wait and watch. The wind suddenly shifted as Barjag let out a hiss of amusement. What of the hunt for the heir? Vilman asked. Pendragon. He has come back to the world, but we know not his name, Gron whispered. Conditoris's lineage must not return to the world. He may not know of who he is, Dorrigan whispered. A creature may bear power and not know it is his to wield. All right, Iorlem whispered to Gilorn. Time to go. We can't, Gilorn argued. We still have more to hear. Any information we get here won't do the general any good unless we bring it back, Iorlem hissed. Anyway, the orcs are onto us. If we stay, they will smell us out. Gilorn couldn't argue with this, so they waited for another breeze to blow by, and, as it did, they put back the brushes they had set aside and crept away. The immortals continued their meeting without any interruption. Eventually, they departed on their various paths. Dorrigan went north, Vilman headed west, and Barjag south. Ramal went straight up into the sky on his new-found wings. Gron waited until the others left, and then set his raptor to slowly trot along to the east, towards his wasteland. After 4 days of hard riding, Gilorn and Iorlem finally arrived at Islesfield. The watchers on the walls, men dressed in black and blue cloaks with white and gold embossed patterns on them, challenged them with the passcodes. Gilorn responded over the wind and the side gate opened. They entered the fortress, which was lit all around them with torches and lights coming from the citadel. Sounds like Turgon's leading the party tonight, Iorlem observed, after he gave his horse to the stable boy. You say that every night, Gilorn muttered, nodding to the gate captain in respect. I wonder why, Iorlem mused ironically, showing no such respect to the captain. Suddenly, he noticed a stable boy who was dressed in leather with the symbol of a horse on it. What is that? Are you falling in love? Gilorn asked. Iorlem punched him in the chest. What the fuck is Horseland doing here? He was referring to Rome's sister kingdom. The Angevin Empire to the north was known as Horseland to everyone except a small number of proud traditionalists. His question was answered by a horn blast from the western gate. Riders in the night? Gilorn wondered aloud. This must be important. That's a Horseland delegation. The immortals did say they had plans, Gilorn shrugged. Could they have acted so quickly? Not even a crow can fly so far so quickly. No, he looked towards the west gate. They were beginning to raise the portcullis. They set out long before we did. They're here for another reason. Make way for Richard, of many titles. Make way for the king. A man called out, and out of the darkness rode 20 horsemen. Now that's an interesting sight. Iorlem nodded in wonderment, as Gilorn and himself jumped out of the way of the horsemen. He was right. The man they assumed to be Richard was a huge man. He stood over 6 feet tall and wore a cloak of dire wolf skin on his back. His huge beard rolled down to his chest. His helmet was huge, golden, and carved in the form of a snarling wolf. Its eyes were replaced with rubies and its giant mouth opened wide to cover his whole head. This, along with his cloak, gave him a hugely dog-like appearance. But as soon as he dismounted and removed his helm, he turned out to be quite well groomed with his rosy red hair. A series of hounds ran up to him and began jumping up and down at his feet. "Edric," he roared, with a voice so loud it made their hearts skip a beat. A squire dismounted from his horse and ran over to him. "Feed the dogs." His voice wasn't a shout, but it was so booming it was easily mistaken for one. "Yes, my lord," the squire called back. He bowed and rushed back to his horse for the dog's food. "Tiberius," Richard called back. A man in hardened leather armor rode over with his horse. This was Prince Tiberius, Richard's son and heir. He wasn't the oldest child to Richard, but he was the only son. He was very much the heir apparent in Horseland, and it came across in his bearing. He was tall and proud, if not a bit severe. "Father," he responded, "the men will require food and rest. Our brothers of the kingdom seem to have plenty of both." "Yes, indeed, father," Tiberius nodded. He pulled his horse back and removed his own helm, a heavy steel piece with a plain golden crown around the top, not the impressive ornament one would expect on a prince. The company banner-bearer lowered his polearm with relief. He must have been bearing the banner all day and night. "It seems we are lacking a welcome party," Richard scowled, looking around the courtyard. "We are a day early, father," Tiberius called back. Conditoris often counselled against being early as well as being late. "Old men say a lot of things," Richard grunted. "I should know, being one myself." "You're not old, father," Tiberius smiled. "You're youth incarnate, just several years late." Richard roared with laughter and then made his way over to the stairs to the citadel. Gilorn and Iorlem were standing by the stairs, slightly to one side, to allow the procession through before them. They bowed as they approached. Richard ignored them, but when Tiberius walked past, he paused. "Rangers, why are you in full armor and kit at this hour? I thought that Dacians only left their citadels so dressed to meet the enemy in battle." Gilorn bowed and spoke to the prince's feet. "We have had special orders from General Felthor." "Ah," Tiberius smiled and nodded. "You are the Kingslayer then?" He addressed this to Iorlem. "Why, yes," Iorlem smirked. "Am I as you expected?" Tiberius said nothing but scrutinized Iorlem closely. "Careful," he smiled. "Lying to a prince is a serious crime. You may rise." Iorlem spluttered and nearly fell backwards. Gilorn laughed. "You've heard of me, I take it?" Tiberius nodded. "Alistair," he pronounced the name in the traditional Greek accent, "has made a very clear point of telling me who is who in the kingdom. I take it you are the infamous Iorlem." "Infamous, am I?" Iorlem smiled. "Very," Tiberius nodded. "Come, your master awaits." The hall was filled with people. It had changed from when Gilorn had first been in there. There were 6 tables now instead of the single long one in the middle. There was a table on the far side where the garrison commanders and the generals were sitting. Falthor was sitting in the center on an ornately carved throne, with Turgon and Cullis next to him. Next to Turgon sat the newly arrived Richard. The two were arm wrestling with each other over a silver plate of roast pig. The battle seemed fairly evenly matched, and an end seemed very far off. Tiberius laughed slightly at the sight, and they proceeded to the main table. "Started without me, have you?" he asked the group at large. "A king's prerogative," Richard smiled, his concentration not breaking from Turgon. "You do realize that if you keep wrestling," Gilorn said, "you won't be able to have any food or drink." I once fucked a girl with one hand and killed the man trying to stop us with the other, Turgon said, taking a swig of wine from his cup with his other hand. I'm not worried. Well, fortunately for me, Tiberius smiled, I don't have to be. And he took out the pig from under them and carried it over to his seat. Turgon looked furiously at him, but his lapse in concentration cost him the match. Richard threw his fist against the table with a loud thud. He let out a roar of triumph and raised his hands high for all to see. You haven't changed at all, my good king, Felthor smiled, toasting him with a drink. What can Islesfield offer its new champion? Wine, Richard shouted. His request was anticipated in a heartbeat. A barrel of wine was brought to him. Quench your thirst later, my friend. Felthor beckoned to Gilorn and Iorlem to approach. We have business to discuss. Consulus, Gilorn greeted, saluting as he and Iorlem stepped to one side so they were standing in the middle of the red carpet in front of the main table. They bowed and waited to be allowed to straighten up. Felthor gave it to them instantly, and they stood at ease. Did you find the enemy? Felthor demanded hurriedly. Was our intelligence from the border reliable? Yes, it was, my lord. Gilorn nodded as he bowed. He turned to Richard and Tiberius. It is good that you have come, my lords, for this news concerns your lands as well. Small wonder, Turgon smiled. Everything concerns you horse lovers in some form or another. Tiberius chuckled as he graciously took a sip of his drink. Do tell, Kingslayer. Gilorn nodded, but it was Iorlem who answered. We came to a clearing in the forest where 4 men met in council with entourages of orcs, wraiths, men of malice, and shadows of others. Felthor inclined his head. Who were they? They bore the titles of the immortals in the first tales, my lord. Gilorn continued the story. One man seemed to be higher than the others. On top of his green skin, he wore a crown of black iron. He welcomed another rider named Dorogon. Another was of gladium. Then another arrived, clad in animal skins and a beast of a man. Richard suddenly choked on his wine, and he sprayed it from his mouth. Tiberius dropped his fork. You appear to have touched a nerve, Turgon smirked. He was right. A chill had undoubtedly washed over the lords of Horseland. Are you certain? Richard demanded. He rushed at Gilorn, diving over the table and grabbing him by his cloak. Tell me. He was decisively terrifying. We are certain, my lord, Gilorn spluttered. He knew better than to try to fight him off. He could see Richard's war axe from this angle. It was just as tall as he was, and it glinted in the flames. Do you know of this man? Felthor asked, standing up and nodding cautiously to Tiberius. His presence did the job, and Richard let Gilorn go. Yes, Tiberius answered. We should take this behind closed doors. Why? Turgon protested. The meat and wine is here. Because this warrior is no man, Tiberius shook his head, talking in a hushed but clear voice. He is Exitum itself. The words seemed to whisper around the hall, to the point that every man at the feast heard it, and a chilled silence fell upon the hall. The silence seemed to reach into Gilorn's ears, and distantly he could hear the thunderclap Barjag had made on his arrival. The word had the same effect on the lords as well. Yes, Felthor agreed, as he nodded feverishly. Yes, come. We will discuss more in my war room.